Another edition of Beat the Closing Number presented by TheLines.com. I'm Eli Hershkovich, joined by the legendary Jay Bilas. On Duke from 1982 to 1986, helped lead Duke to the Final Four in the national championship in his senior year. And now for my money and for many other people's money, I'll take money out of people's pocket, the best college basketball analyst around. How you doing, Jay?
That was kind. I'm doing great. I hope you are too.
I'm excited to break down the Sweet 16 with you. And let's start off kind of looking at this thing broadly with the SEC having a conference record, 7 teams in the Sweet 16, the Big 10, the Big 12, and the ACC with Duke making up the rest of it. Do you think this represents college hoops with the NIL and a new era, or do you see this as a byproduct of just the dominance of some of these upper echelon seeds?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily dominance. I think it's 1 year. We've had years like this before where we didn't have as much quote unquote chaos in the first and second rounds as we've had in other years. It's a year to year thing. And what I think people tend to forget, it's a lot of, in my view, facile interpretation. Like, we didn't get as many upsets as we tend to like or fans tend to like in the first 2 rounds. Therefore, it's the fault of NIL and the portal. It's just not true. So, one, the NIL and the portal spreads talent out. It doesn't concentrate it. And so you've had a lot of people say, and it's a fact that this year all 16 teams came from 4 conferences. But what they're not talking about is the schools portal. 2 years ago, Houston was in the American Athletic Conference. BYU was in the West Coast Conference. And Arizona was in the Pac-12. So with the same field 2 years ago, we'd have 7 different conferences. Would that make people feel better? We classified BYU as a mid-major 2 years ago. And we classified Houston, frankly, as a mid-major because they played in the American. They're the same teams. And out of the American, Houston went to the Final Four. It's the same program, same team. So if having 7 different conferences would make people feel better, that's not the portal or NIL. That's the schools choosing to bolt where they've been and the commitment they made and not wanting to go through adversity and all the things we say about players. That changed. Drake, Colorado State, New Mexico, McNeese, Gonzaga, St. Mary's, all won first-round games. Colorado State was a buzzer shot against Maryland from going to the Sweet 16. That's just happenstance, not some NIL thing, not some portal thing. So one data point does not make a trend. This is 1 year. So what I would say is, let's pump the brakes on this. Sky is falling. The tournament's never going to be the same type of business. And I think you've seen in the last several days, and I don't have a problem with it. I understand how the world works, but the coaches portal is always open. And nobody calls that tampering or poaching or has a problem with the coaches and their commitment. And are they willing to go through adversity? Do they show loyalty? Those coaches, Darian DeVries, one of them, Ben McCollum, you name it. There are a whole bunch of them. They were negotiating their out while the tournament was going on. Will Wade at McNeese. They were negotiating their way out while the tournament was going on. So, the players shouldn't be put in a separate category, in my view. I get it. People think this is different. But we're looking at players and coaches and schools, frankly, through a different lens, and I don't think that's particularly fair.
Well said. And let's get into the action for the Sweet 16, looking at arguably the game of the night on Thursday night in the East region. Number 1 seed Duke against 5 seed Arizona. Blue Devils holding steady is about a 9-point favorite, total of 153.5. And I believe you were on the call for this game in Tucson. Both of these teams are evolved from that meeting where Duke won by double digits. Sion James was coming off the bench, for instance. Awaka for Arizona as well, along with some bench pieces for both teams dealing with their respective injuries. But what kind of outcome are you expecting this time around?
Well, Duke's the better team, and so oftentimes you think the better team should win. That doesn't always happen. Arizona is much better now than they were in November, December when that game was played. But so is Arizona. Arizona's different too. And I think a lot of it's going to depend on the kind of offense that Arizona is able to run against Duke's defense. If Arizona is unable to get out in transition and get offensive rebounds, which they do pretty well in both categories, they're going to have to really execute well in the half court. And Duke's a difficult half court defense to deal with because they're so long and so active. Their length, I think, is undervalued in their defensive efficiency. They have a lot of long arm defenders, and their help side is very good and very active. So if you think you're going to keep the ball on one side of the floor and just make a dribble move and attack that defense, it's not going to work. There's going to have to be, you're going to have ball reversals and cutting and really move that defense. And you're going to have to move Kaman Malawach away from the basket. He's a very good rim protector, lane protector. But their length is considerable. And along with Houston, I think they're the best defensive team in the country.
On that note, how important for this round or for the Elite Eight is it for Duke to get Malik Brown back from that shoulder injury?
It would be really helpful. I don't think, honestly, you could see much of a drop-off when they played Baylor. Baylor's a good team. They're not great, but they're good. And they were never in the game, in my view, maybe the first 5 minutes. But outside of that, it was decided. So Brown just offers them another sort of versatile defender and very good passer that can switch out onto anybody. He, even being out for a number of games, I don't know how many he's been out this year with that shoulder thing because it's happened twice to him. He leads the team by far in deflections. He's just got a unique ability to get his hands on the basketball. Whether you're holding it or whether you're letting it fly in the air, he can deflect it. And but he was all defensive team in the ACC at Syracuse. It was just undervalued because Syracuse wasn't on television as much and wasn't as good of a team. He goes to Duke, and now everybody knows it. And that's one of the things about the portal. Like, some of these coaches get to go to better opportunities, and we celebrate that. And Malik Brown found a better opportunity, and everybody knows his name now. Hardly anybody knew his name beforehand outside of the basketball literati.
One last note on this game before we move on to the other number one seed on Thursday night. Caleb Love, the biggest wild card arguably in this game, 1 of 9 shooting from deep in that first meeting where Arizona lost by double figures, but scored 29 points, 5 threes in the round of 32 victory over Oregon, and famously known for taking down Coach K in his last ever game against Duke in the 2022 Final Four. So how do you think Love fares this time around in his last rendition against Duke?
I don't know. You mentioned the wild card status. Sometimes he's an ace, and most times, but sometimes he's a joker. That's how wild cards go. And I don't mean that in a negative way. You just mean that if he's aggressive in taking good shots, he's one of the best scorers in the country. And I usually, the way I look at it, it's just my view. I think you can track how aggressive he is in the most intelligent way by how many free throws he shoots. He's such a strong athlete and such a strong driver. When he balances out perimeter shooting with putting the ball on the deck and attacking the defense and getting to the foul line, that's where he's really in my view, the most dangerous. But the problem that Arizona has is he's going to be guarded by big, strong, long-arm defenders. I don't know who Duke's going to start off on him because Duke does a lot of switching, but I could see Sion James being on him. That's a tough matchup because Sion James can devote all his attention to him without helping off and just try to shut him down. Arizona has other scorers, but they don't have scorers as potent as Love and as likely to go off for 30 in a game. Because, we've seen him do it, and we've seen him do it against Duke at Cameron in the Final Four. He's done it before, so he's going to come into that game confident.
Over to the West region, the game I teased, number 1 seed Florida taking on 4th seeded Maryland. And this question has been tossed around kind of like the NIL thing over the last couple of days, a little bit more niche. Did Derek Queen, in your eyes, travel on that buzzer beater to send the Terps to the round of 32. To me, it reminded me after watching the replay of Tremont Waters and his near travel against Maryland going back to the 2019 tournament on his buzzer beater. Apples and oranges, it's so hard to call in the moment. I don't think you can, but where are you on that one?
I'll say this. There are a couple things. One, when I watched the game live, as you probably did, and I didn't see a travel when it was live. With all the replays, I think you could say, all right, well, I can see maybe I need to look at it again and again. I think if you have to look at it 2 or 3 times, you're probably on the side of, I don't think that should have been called. And obviously the officials are looking at that real time. I don't subscribe to the theory that, you just don't call that at that point in the game. If you walked, call it. If you didn't, don't. But I didn't see it live. So that's one thing. When, Gene Steratore is an awesome guy. I'm sure he was a great official. I always hate it when broadcasters say, well, we have a great officiating crew. How do we know? I don't know whether these guys are good or not. You figure like what we should be saying is this is a veteran officiating crew that has been doing Final Fours and all that stuff. I don't know whether they're good or not. But anyway, when Gene Steratore was talking about it, he talked about the rule and then sort of endorsed the call. And I don't have any reason to argue with that. When I've discussed this with supervisors, this kind of thing, one of the things I always ask is after they say, okay, this is the rule, I think it was properly called. I always ask, okay, if it were called to travel and I asked you about it, would you say it was a bad call? That's what I would like to have heard from Gene or another officiating expert. That to me is the question. If it were called to travel, would you tell me it was a bad call? Or an incorrect call. Bad call, it has a connotation to it. Would you say it was an incorrect call? My sense is if the official had called to travel, people in a supervisory role or an expert commentating on it, like a Gene Steratore, not him, but like a Gene Steratore, would have, my guesses would have said, yeah, it was a travel. But I don't know that for sure. That's just been my experience in talking about this with officials on calls like that. But I have no qualm with it at all because and this isn't to say this is the right way to do it, but when I'm calling a game, if I have to look at the replay to determine whether it was right or wrong, I usually never say anything. If I don't say it at the time, like if I can't see it, why would I expect the official to see it? That's sort of my way of looking at it. And maybe I violated my own rule at times and gone and, said, hey, I had one in the SEC tournament where a guy tapped a ball out on a rebound. They called a foul on him. And I go, that doesn't look like a foul. Like he's just tapping it out. And then you looked at it on a replay and I go, that was a terrible call. I mean, that was horrible. Stuff like that. So there are times I go back at replay and maybe confirm that I said, I don't think that's right. So maybe I violate my own rule. So, whistle me and call foul on me for that one.
Fair enough. Well, I can't wait to get your analysis on this game. If we look at Florida and Maryland, Gators were tested by the 2-time defending champs on Sunday. Walter Clayton, though, taking over down the stretch. And meanwhile, the Terps haven't lost a single game this year by more than 6 points. Unsurprisingly, the line for this game is pretty much consensus Florida minus 6.5. And the great guard matchup between Clayton and Gillespie and the bigs with Florida against Queen and Reese. So what are your expectations for this very heightened Sweet 16 matchup?
I think Florida and Duke are the 2 best teams in the country. That's not to say that Houston or Auburn aren't, right there. But I think if this were the NBA playoffs, we'd see Florida and Duke going against each other. If they were 7-game series, that's how highly I think of those 2 teams and how they're playing right now. Florida is bigger across the board. They're deeper across the board, and they have something that very few teams have. They have a certified bucket getter that can create his own in Walter Clayton Jr. Like what he did in the last minutes against UConn won the game because UConn was headed toward an upset there. I mean, it sounds bizarre to say UConn an upset in the same breath, but UConn was they were primed to win that game, and but for the heroics, and Walter Clayton Jr. putting the cape on at the end of that game, Florida probably wouldn't have survived that. And having that sort of weapon in your arsenal is that's a force multiplier. So I mean, it's not to say Maryland, excuse me, Maryland can't win. They can, but I certainly favor Florida. I think they're better.
I'm sure you saw at least a video or two of the post-game antics from Dan Hurley, and everyone, and you and myself included, respect he and his coaching staff for, on a short prep, that was arguably the toughest matchup Florida could have faced in the round of 32. But as a person and as a coach, and you've spoken to many coaches, I'm sure, over the last few days, whether it's about Hurley or something completely different, what did you make of the situation post-game with his complaints about the officiating?
I'm kind of both sides on this one. On one hand, it's not that big of a deal. Coaches and players can get hot after a game, and when they're going into the tunnel, into the locker room, I've been there. There are a lot of things said that perhaps shouldn't be said when there are cooler heads. But I do think that we should be clear that shouldn't have been said, and it's not appropriate. But once you get past that and acknowledge that, is it really that big of a deal? Probably not. My biggest issue is, there can be two things that are true at the same time. Like, Dan Hurley is a great guy. He is a great guy, and he's a fabulous coach. Maybe the best in the country. He's right there as the best in the country. And he's an intense person, an intense competitor. All that's great. I celebrate all those things. But when there are instances where things cross the line, it's okay for people to say, shouldn't do that. And it's okay for him and his people to say, you know what, we shouldn't have done that. You can acknowledge that. And I don't know whether this is true, but there was a report that a UConn administrator made a threat essentially to that reporter. Now, whether the reporter should have captured that on video, whether that was allowed or not, I don't know. But whether it was captured on video, whether it was just said and reported by what was heard, to me, it's all the same thing. Those things aren't appropriate. Do I understand it in the heat of the moment? Yes. Should excuses be made for it? No. And what I would ask is, if a player had done that, what would the UConn administration and coaching staff have said? They should have said, that was inappropriate, the player shouldn't have done that, and we've addressed it. Why not just say that about the coaching staff? It's not that big of a deal, in my view. Now, other people may look at it differently. Like, UConn and Dan Hurley can do whatever they want. Like, First Amendment guarantees, you can respond to whoever you want. Go ahead. But the First Amendment also extends to us saying, that's inappropriate. We're allowed to do that. But it doesn't change my view of Dan Hurley as one of the truly great guys out there. He's a fabulous guy and a fabulous coach. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. You can make a mistake. It's fine. I just think if we can tell a player you should strive to be better, we should be able to tell a coach you should strive to be better.
Yeah, it goes back to our original conversation with holding players and coaches shifting around to different programs to the same standard. But moving over to Friday, number 1 overall seed Auburn against 5th seeded Michigan in the South region. And the Tigers are 8.5-point favorites, total of around 153.5. And as we saw in the round of 32, Michigan, at least for me on paper, surprised me with their ability to limit turnovers, I think right around 9 or on the dot 9. And rebounding wasn't an issue. In fact, they out-rebounded Texas A&M. Like many thought, you have Auburn out-dueling Creighton in the second half after Creighton shot 9 of 14 in the first half from behind the arc. So do you think Michigan can hang with another physical SEC opponent and arguably the best team in college basketball? Or how do you see this one playing out?
Of course, I think Michigan can hang and Michigan can win. I don't think they will. I think Auburn's a better team. But Auburn does one thing that Texas A&M does not do. They shoot it. Their guards, unless things have changed in the last couple of games, I haven't looked at their numbers in the last day or two, but Auburn, their four guards, shoot 40% basically from three as a group, and they shoot over 88% from the foul line. Those are impressive numbers, and they've done it in really big games, and they've played, I think, the toughest schedule in the country, and they've done incredibly well against it. Last 3-4 games, have they played their best? Not in my view, but they get some time to go home and work on things and get refocused. And all they're doing is driving an hour and a half to Atlanta for these games in the Sweet 16 and Elite Eight if they make it that far. So with their guards and with Janai Broome, and Dylan Cardwell is one of the best defenders in the country. He's a big man that can switch out onto guards and one of the great help defenders and rim protectors. They've got more depth, more length, more athleticism, and they shoot it better. So to me, and they're a really good offensive rebounding team. They're not as good as Texas A&M, but the one thing, like Texas A&M misses a lot of shots. They have to be a good offensive rebounding team. So I tend to favor Auburn in this one.
Heading over to Indianapolis, speaking about the last 1 seed that we haven't discussed in the finale of the Sweet 16 on Friday night. 1 seed Houston taking on 4-seeded Purdue. Like Auburn, Houston right around an 8-point favorite, total of 132.5. Now, Purdue hasn't fared well against teams that have pressured Braden Smith in their backcourt throughout the season, whether it is aforementioned Texas A&M in mid-December, Marquette earlier in the year, or Auburn as well. And Denver Jones, speaking of Auburn's backcourt, shut down Braden Smith in that matchup. Now, Houston forcing the 18th highest turnover percentage nationally. Texas A&M, Auburn also imposed their will in terms of forcing turnovers and on the glass. And Houston, one of the most relentless, as you know, teams on the boards with Juwan Roberts and company. So even with home court advantage or some semblance of home court advantage in mind for Purdue, can the Boilermakers space out this Houston defense enough, or do you think Houston's physicality dominates and we see maybe a lower scoring game or Houston wins by double figures?
It'll definitely be lower scoring than I think maybe fans or Purdue would like. I did that Purdue-Auburn game in Birmingham in December, and they overwhelmed Purdue with athleticism, their size, and their depth. What Houston does is every time there's some sort of ball screen action, they trap it. And when you pick your dribble up, they'll recover. And then anything that goes into the post, they trap it. They call it monster. They're coming. And for Purdue to win, they have got to get Braden Smith and Trey Kaufman-Renn into ball screen situations, which Houston guards really well. And they got to get it inside to Trey Kaufman-Renn, who's their leading scorer. He averages about 20 a game. He's been terrific in the tournament. But this is a different kind of animal they're playing against in this Houston defense. So Purdue's going to have to be incredibly efficient on offense, and they're going to have to do a great job on the glass with all 5 guys rebounding and have their best game to win. This is a little bit of a step up in competition for them. They played really good teams, but I tend to think that look, I thought Houston was a Final Four team last year. Had Jamal Shead not been injured against Duke in the first half, I think they win that game, and I think they beat NC State and go to the Final Four. I still think UConn would have won the national championship. But this year, I do think they're Final Four worthy again, and I think they're significantly better than Purdue.
Wrapping this thing up, 2 years ago, you came on this show, and you called San Diego State outright over Alabama as a 7.5-point underdog. So not only did the Aztecs win that game, they beat Creighton, they beat Florida Atlantic, FAU, and advanced to the national championship before losing in that first rendition of UConn's back-to-back national championship. So I'll ask you this. If you had to pick one underdog on Thursday's games, we'll get to Friday's games or the ones we haven't discussed yet, but looking at BYU against Alabama, which could feature the highest tournament total since 1995, or Arkansas against Texas Tech, which underdog do you give the better chance of winning outright?
Probably, I think they both have a really good chance to win. I would probably say BYU because neither Alabama nor BYU are great defensive teams. I do think that's going to be a track meet. And the reason I say BYU isn't just because they're really good, and they are. They're really good. And they both, Alabama and BYU, make over 10 threes a game. But they get them in a little bit different ways. Alabama is more of a slot driving team. They're going to put the ball on the deck, and they're going to get in the paint and be able to spray it. And they like to shoot in the first 8 to 10 seconds of a shot clock because they're going to get a better shot then than if they can, move it around. The more they move the ball around, the more likely they are to turn it over, and they'd rather get a shot, which leads to better results than a turnover, obviously. But Mark Sears has not shot the ball well over his last 5 or 6 games. I think if I remember right, he's like 5 for 35 in his last 6 games from 3. He's still really effective because he's kind of a Jalen Brunson type presence for Alabama, but I think BYU can beat them. And look, Arkansas can win also, but I tend to, in those games, I tend to favor a BYU upset just a little bit more than an Arkansas upset. But you pick against Arkansas, and they got this. They have like an old UMass Calipari refuse to lose vibe about them. They shoot 2 for 9 or 2 for 19 against St. John's from 3, and they give up 28 offensive rebounds, and they won. Like, that's impossible, but they did it. And there's no reason. If you can beat St. John's, you can beat Texas Tech. Although Texas Tech shoots it better. I don't know if Chance McMillan will be back. He's a 14-point-a-game guy. If he's not back, that limits the effectiveness of Texas Tech. But Texas Tech is really good offensively. If their defense plays at its best, certainly Texas Tech should be favored in that game.
How about Friday? Kentucky swept Tennessee in the regular season. Obviously, different ball game in the Sweet 16 in Indianapolis. And then Ole Miss against Michigan State, rematch of the 2019 Final Four between Chris Beard when he was with Texas Tech, leading the Red Raiders to an overtime loss to Virginia, against Tom Izzo and the Spartans. So between those two dogs, Kentucky and Ole Miss, who would you take, if either, to pull off the outright upset?
I would take Ole Miss. I don't think Kentucky beating Tennessee is an upset. They've already done it twice, and they've done it with different circumstances, including being shorthanded. Tennessee is a really good defensive team. They don't switch very much. They like to stay with their own and fight through things. And I think that makes it can make it difficult because of the reads and the cutting and the fact that Kentucky can initiate offense from all over the floor. With Amari Williams, you can get the ball into the post. He can be 3 steps off the post in the mid post, and they can initiate offense there. And with their split action, they call it rifle action. Some of their staggers and stuff. It's hard to guard if you're not going to switch. And Tennessee will emergency switch, but they're not generally a switching team. Ole Miss is an interesting group. They don't do, in my view, anything great. Like, they don't have this one area where they're elite, but they do everything well, and they've got really good players. One thing that they do is their turnover margin is really good. So they do not turn it over much, and they tend to force turnovers off of their opponent. And so I tend to think that Ole Miss going against Michigan State, Michigan State has not shot the ball well. And but the one area where Ole Miss is really vulnerable, in my view, is they're not a great rebounding team. That's an area where they've said, okay, well, we got to rebound in this game. The truth is, you got to rebound in every game, and I know Chris Beard knows that and preaches it. But they've not shown to be a great rebounding team, and that's what Michigan State does. That's in their DNA. So that can be the separating factor. But I tend to think that Ole Miss, with the schedule they've played, they're not going to look at Michigan. Michigan State is really good, but they're not this intimidating. You take one look at them. It's not like they're 2000, 2001 teams where you are afraid of them. You're not afraid of them. And Ole Miss isn't going to be scared by, after an SEC slate, they're not going to be scared by Michigan State looking down at the other end of the floor when they're warming up.
Yeah, I'm with you. Everything, in some senses, favors Ole Miss when you look at transition defense and the ability to force turnovers And they play their no-middle defense with Beard and Mark Adams, so you force Michigan State outside of the paint. But the rebounding issue could loom large. It didn't against Iowa State, but that's because they forced turnovers and no Keyshawn Gilbert. You also faced UNC in their second game in a week. So hard to tell what's going to happen in that matchup between Ole Miss and Michigan State before Auburn and Michigan take the floor in the second leg of that Sweet 16 in Atlanta. But last question for you, Jay. With all the action going on at Rupp over the weekend in Lexington, how much were you craving one of those ice cream cones?
Every single day. And in fact, when I go other places and they don't bring me an ice cream cone, I think it's a tragedy. I've become accustomed to, getting treated like royalty with an ice cream cone during a game, which what could be better than that? There's nothing better than watching a game at Rupp alone, but watching it with ice cream makes it a religious experience.
Maybe we can get UConn's media coordinator on that for you to get you an ice cream cone at the next event.
Like you could have had an ice cream cone sent to me for this.
That's true.
That's going to factor into my decision making in the future.
Next year, I'll get you an ice cream cone and a bucket of ice cream at that. But he is Jay Bilas, the best college basketball analyst around. Jay, as always, every year, appreciate the time.
No, thank you. My pleasure.